Thank you for this invitation to read and review the English edition of Dear Ariyasinha. I have so much to say about this book, so I won't waste too much time on a preamble, but just jump straight in. Dear Ariyasinha is a collection of 30 letters written to the eponymous Ariyasinha, a singular protester at the Gall-Face Green protests in 2022. In these 30 letters, spanning from April 2022 to July 2022, the writer commiserates with his friend and their difficulties, but also brings awareness to the sufferings and tribulations of the Tamil people from the time of Sri Lankan independence and before. The eponymous Ariyasinha acts as a symbol for many singular Sri Lankans who are ignorant of, or oblivious to, or purposefully turned away from what took place during the ethnic conflict. And thus, as the writer communicates with his Ariyasinha, we see his desire to speak to and be heard by the greater Sinhalese community in Sri Lanka. These letters are earnest, full of emotion, and that's what makes the book so readable. The language is powerful, emotive, and speaks to years of anger, frustration, and despair. And that is one of the great strengths of the book, because facts, statistics, and figures do not accurately reflect the lived experiences of those who suffered in war. Death rates do not convey how the lives of thousands were turned upside down. By giving the details of lived experiences, Sinhalese people of all ages and generations can understand what took place. This is their history as much as Sigiriya or Prince Vijaya. It is important for them to know what took place, and the book emotively recounts it. I'm just going to give you a quick example, if I may. In letter 6, Anbarasa writes, "Can you imagine how, as children, we managed to study in the meager light of the copper kadawa lamp? You would have never thought of saving a toffee or a tiny piece of dried palmyra fruit pulp or a pinch of sugar and drinking tea by just holding a portion of it in your palms and licking it. We have spent most of our nights in bunkers, not in bed. You would not know our plight behind buying a loaf of bread. We had to finish our dinner early and spend the night in front of a bakery, sleeping on the old newspapers we had taken. Dawn of the next day would not be normal, though. After buying the bread, we had to take our lives in our hands and run with the bread before being attacked by bombers that would often hover over our heads. We have traveled more on bicycles or boats than in buses and other vehicles, and have also walked most of the distance. Did you know we had to wash our clothes in palmyra fruit juice? Unfortunately, sometimes stray cattle nibble on them due to the fragrance of the fruit. We then had to hide our self-respect with our hands. Can you even imagine such an incident?" These examples of lived experiences are also important for those of us who are second generation and living in the diaspora. Family members might tell us something about what they experienced in Sri Lanka, but trauma can be intensely difficult to overcome. And many people who moved to the diaspora adopted a mantra of looking forward and not back. And so for people like me, born outside of Sri Lanka, this book is a must-read resource. It shows us that our history and legacy is not only conflict, death, and destruction, but also resilience and innovation, of survival. It is not a surprise that the book has been written or translated into 3 languages. The whole point of the book, at least in my reading, is to show the importance of speaking, the importance of communicating across the divide. Language, we all know, can be a barrier to progress, to true understanding, to true human connection. By publishing the book in 3 languages, the barriers between communities are broken down in order to share and communicate. Reverend Father Anbarasa writes in his preface that originally he set out to write just the 1 letter. One became 30 as 20 years worth of bottled up experiences burst out. This book is an ode then to the power of communicating and sharing. As Anbarasa himself says, "Opening up to you to share our thoughts fills me with an abundance of solace. Moreover, I decided to continue this conversation as this sharing could serve as a means to create mutual understanding between us. There is solace in being able to express your griefs and be heard. There is power also in hearing the plight of others and learning. The intention behind the book is made clear in the blurb and made clear in every letter written. The Sinhalese community must know what happened to their fellow Sri Lankans, and education and listening is a key tool to prevent further turmoil. Words are not the only way the writer chooses to communicate. There are illustrations as well, turning the verbal into the visual. What are the purposes of these illustrations? I would argue that they offer another way to express experiences, to get across the suffering and unremitting socio-political strife. One of the key things that stood out to me is how these letters mingle and balance anger as well as deep empathy and love. Just to show you one example, here are some excerpts from letter 1. It is me, your friend Anburasa, writing to you. Are you doing well? Ariyasinha, I learnt you have been on the gall-faced green for the past 5 days. No one would have imagined such a pathetic plight during your New Year season. How's the situation there now? I recall memories of some decades past at this moment. The war had chased us away from our homes and villages. We were displaced several times, weeping and wondering. Were you deaf at that time to our cry of pain? Why didn't you utter even a word of solace? Our children starved for years without food. You didn't turn to look at us, nor did you pity our plight. We were bombarded, literally. Our sisters were molested and our brothers were persecuted. You were unmindful and ignored us. We were abducted, shot, and thrown on the roads. You neither came nor sympathized. Our agricultural lands were confiscated to build military camps. It didn't concern you, and you were not bothered. When we were forcibly made to disappear and even buried, you were indifferent. When the day finally arrived in 2009 due to the collusion of other countries, tens of thousands of us were killed. Many of us struggled for life and the rest were confined to refugee camps. You celebrated this with your kiribath of boiled rice, with coconut milk, with festivities and bursts of firecrackers, making it the National Victory Day. We had to, and still have to, bow down in humiliation. Today, you mourn over the daily blackouts, fuel scarcity, cooking gas, and milk powder. You feel helpless over the rising price of essential items. But we survived for over 3 decades without any of these commodities because of the economic embargo imposed by the government on the north and east. Ariyasinha, if again fuel, electricity, milk powder, and cooking gas become available without interruption, your problems will be solved. But the solution for our struggles and aspirations? Nevertheless, we assure you, we are there for you and with you at this time of distress to help you and share what we have with you. Let us pray that our country bounces back from this crisis. If time permits, let us continue to share our experiences, not just for discussion, but in order to find solutions. There are people who see reconciliation as Tamils. There are those who see reconciliations as Tamils forgetting what they have experienced generation after generation and moving on. There are those who see reconciliation as impossible because these deep traumas of soul, culture, body, and land cannot be forgotten. The book, with each letter, offers us a different perspective. It urges us to see that people must be held to account for what they did and what they did not do, for the crimes they committed and the crimes they turned a blind eye to. It shows us that those who have been traumatized deserve the right to voice these truths. But it also argues that true reconciliation cannot come without empathy, without seeing the people across the divide as fellows and as siblings. Letter 1 begins with empathy and ends with empathy. In letter 3, Anburasa says, please do take care of your health, as you have been on the protest site many days and nights. In doing so, the book shows us how we can be angry and loving, truthful, open, and without hatred. It shows us a path of greater emotional maturity and fellowship. The book is structurally fascinating. It connects the present and the past continuously to showcase how the events of the past affect daily life. Anbarasa uses the letter written on Maundy Thursday to remind us of the historical and political betrayals. He uses the Gulface Green protests to recall the 1956 protests against the Singular Only Act and the acts of violence perpetrated by the government in retaliation against peaceful protests. He remarks on how members of the Christian clergy and religious from the South joined the Gulface Green protest as a sign of solidarity, but then compares this to the silence following the multiple bombings and shellings on churches and other places of worship, leading to the deaths of Tamils. Anbarasa uses the Gulface protests as a way to force empathy, to connect their experiences with ours, and to make the Sinhalese people understand the past and present sufferings of the Tamil people. Anbarasa also draws attention to the circularity of protests in Sri Lanka. He asks, "We were there at Gulface then, and now you are there in that same place after exactly 66 years. What do these recurring events want to deliver to you and us? What is the message underlying these incidents? What is this mystery? I am clueless, Ariyasinha." I believe these repeated acts do show us something. They show us that true reconciliation must take into consideration the past in order to ameliorate the present. Ignoring or wiping the past clean does nothing to promote friendlier feelings in the present. If the past is a foreign country, it must be traversed. There is great truth in the saying, "Those who do not study history are doomed to repeat it." History seems to be repeating itself time and time again in Sri Lanka because the past is not properly looked at, dissected, expressed, communicated, and healed from. Dear Ariyasinha attempts to do just this. In letter 10, Anbarasa imagines what Sinhala readers will say about the letters. He says they might call them post-mortems. I do think this is one accurate description of the book, that it is a series of post-mortems on the experiences, events, and yes, deaths of the past to create greater understanding and insight today and to prevent suffering tomorrow. This then is a book that calls for constitutional reform, for the ousting of corrupt politicians, to decentralize power. It is a book that calls to listen, to pay attention, to ask questions of acts done in the name of religion or state safety, to constantly see parallels between the Tamil community and the Sinhala community. It calls for eyes that look at the Gulface protests and also sees the protests held for those forcibly disappeared, to not look at one protest and turn a blind eye to the other. It's a book that practices radical empathy and calls on all of us to practice it too. It is a definite must-read. It's been a real joy and privilege to read the book and give my thoughts on it. So thank you, Reverend Father Anbarasa, and thank you also MEIVELI publishing team for giving me this opportunity as well.